All right, so first of all, yeah, you did have the Lord of the Rings reference. This is the rotoscope film from 1978. Yeah, this is
Right?
yeah, yeah.
You know, I'm dating myself, but like I saw that in the theater.
Yeah.
I mean, I was 8 years old.
Right, yeah. Captures the imagination at that age, so.
It was as for a boy who read Lord of the Rings at like 6 or 7,
Yeah,
like, it was amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean these kinds of tools that I talked about in that feature, those are becoming sort of available to people to do home stuff. Like you don't have to be a big movie studio to do those kinds of things anymore. At least for short films, we'll see how that works out in practice. So yeah, Sammy Roto was released like late last year, so it's like been literally months since we really had good something that people can just access and do stuff with, which is always the benchmark, right? Like if you want things to kind of open up um, beyond just kind of like maybe one director or one art team, then you got to have the tools. So okay, I'm going to talk about a paper to finish up here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, this is it here. So I'm going to talk about a paper to finish up here. This is it's a target paper, target article from Behavior and Brain Sciences. So if you're not familiar with target articles, they're kind of like these articles that people write and then people respond to them, and be pages and pages of responses. The responses, of course, are like articles in of themselves sometimes, short articles, and they kind of go through, a certain topic. It's usually a niche topic in cognitive science or in neuroimaging or something. And so this has been a tradition for decades where people write these target articles and people respond to them. So this is kind of an open peer commentary before it became cool, I guess, is the idea. Okay, so this article is called a multi-trait embodiment framework for the evolution of brains and cognition across animal phyla. So it's stitching together this idea of phylogenetic cognition, which of course is a theory of cognition, which is very different from, say, like an information processing theory of cognition, at least nominally, because you're talking about basically the question of how does animal cognition evolve? How are forms of animal cognition related across taxa? So if I look at animal cognition in primates, how does that differ from animal cognition in social insects, from animal cognition in cetaceans, and animal cognition like in dogs, cats, and rats? And just like different forms of cognition, how are they all related by common ancestry? How are they unique? And then this is, the idea of embodiment. So we, need to think about cognition in terms of being embodied in a body. So that's kind of what this article is about. So this is from Bowling Green State University in Ohio has a pretty good cognitive science program there. It's very biologically oriented. So this is Cheryl Coombs and Michael Trestman. Okay, so the abstract here reads, among non-human animals, crows, octopuses, and honeybees are well known for their complex brains and cognitive abilities. Widening the lens from the idiosyncratic abilities of exemplars like these to those of animals across the phylogenetic spectrum begins to reveal the ancient history or ancient evolutionary process by which complex brains and cognition first arose in different lineages. The distribution of 35 phenotypic traits in 17 metazoan lineages, so they did an analysis of different phenotypic traits in different lineages, different taxa, reveals that the brain and cognitive complexity in only 3 lineages can be attributed to the pivotal role played by the body, sensory, brain and motor traits, and active visual sensing and visual motor skills. So those three lineages are vertebrates, cephalopod mollusks, and eutheropods. So those are, like not species level groupings, but their groupings. Vertebrates includes a vast number of taxa. Cephalopod mollusks includes a large number of taxa, and eutheropods as well. So they've kind of defined the places in the tree of life where we have this specific type of thing we think of as biological intelligence, or typically think of as biological intelligence. So this is where we have sensory systems, we have a body, we have motor traits, and visual motor traits that kind of come together. And of course, that's, not all of biological intelligence, but that's kind of where you get a common set of traits. Together, these pivotal traits enabled animals to transition from largely reactive to more proactive behaviors. So this is where you have planning, you have prediction, you don't have these kind of reflexes that govern the behavior or dominate the behavior. You have these planning behaviors. You have, types of visual intelligence where you can imagine a different world and then act upon it. Those sorts of things. And so these pivotal traits established animals to transition from reactive to proactive behaviors and from slow and two-dimensional motion to more rapid and complex three-dimensional motion. So this is like if you have motion that isn't based on planning, you don't want to move too far out ahead of yourself. You have a kind of a reference frame that might be like, crawling along a branch, and you're just kind of crawling to the next spot, or you're sensing like a pheromone concentration or a gradient of pheromone, and you're following that gradient. And that's, of course, these are known as taxis, and that's very indicative of what we like to call very simple cognition. In this case, it would be slow and two-dimensional motion, where you're following this gradient from low concentration to high concentration. There's no planning necessarily, it's just following the gradient. Right? We can do this in like a Bradenburg vehicle. We see this in different insects. We see this in cells. We see this in bacteria. So this is something that is differentiated from complex three-dimensional motion, where you have to plan, where you have this dimension of height. So you have three dimensions of space that you're behaving in, and you need to be able to kind of build a model of that within yourself. So you have these internal models that come along with this that are predictive. Among pivotal traits, high-resolution eyes and laminated visual regions of the brain stand out because they increase the processing demands and the computational power of the brain by several orders of magnitude. So this is interesting. High-resolution eyes, of course, are important for sort of getting the information in, being able to sense the environment without, having these very simple sensors that are, two-dimensional, or just basically pick up the information from a gradient, and they pick up like an image of the world. So you have, of course, camera eyes, but you also have compound eyes, and those are two examples of that, where you can get that kind of information into the brain. And then laminated visual regions, which are the part of the brain where you get the structure that's specialized for visual processing. So when they say laminated, they're thinking about like the visual pathway in mammals, where you have multiple centers, or you have multiple layers of processing. So like if we think of the V1 and V2 and V3 and V4 areas of the visual cortex, we have these layers, layered cortex, but also we have these layered regions where you're passing the job off to different modules or different components of this pathway. And, lamination, I think, is important because it allows and we have like in neocortex, we have 6-layered cortex, and we have 6 layers of processing. But we also have 2-layered cortex as well in some species. And the point of this lamination, you can draw a comparison with deep learning, where they discovered that, of course, the more layers you have, the better. But in biological brains, these laminated layers allow you to sort of segregate processing. So you can start at the top with like very simple processing, and you can move down in different layers. And this helps in development, because in development you can get this kind of specialization emerge that you might not be able to get if you just had like kind of one pot of cells that were kind of, having to wire up on their own. It just gives you this, these developmental precursors develop this kind of specialization. Eyes and these laminated visual regions stand out because they increase the processing demands and the computational power of the brain by several orders of magnitude. So this is the sort of the finding. The independent acquisition of pivotal traits in cognitively complex, or CC, lineages, so they define these lineages that they identify with these traits, is cognitively complex, can be explained as the completion of several multi-trait transitions over the course of evolutionary history, each resulting in an increasing level of complexity that arises from a distinct combination of traits. So whereas combined pivotal traits represent the highest level of complexity in CC lineages, combined traits at lower levels characterize many non-CC lineages, suggesting that certain body, sensory, and brain traits may have been linked. So this is what they call the trait linkage hypothesis, which is where you have this linkage, this maybe genetic linkage, or certainly this linkage across evolution where things evolve together. And so you have things that are, they change together, they're conserved together, and they contribute collectively to this higher level of cognitive complexity. And they may also contribute to non-cognitive complexity, so that, it may prevent certain species from becoming cognitively complex, where you need to have everything in place. You basically need to have those things linked in order to have cognitive complexity. So it's an interesting analysis here, and kind of getting into what they propose here. The first is that narrowly distributed pivotal traits enable essential cognitive abilities not previously present, making complex cognition possible. So there are these pivotal traits that define different lineages as cognitively complex, and then two lineages with brain and cognitive complexities follow very similar evolutionary paths, involving major transitions from lesser to greater levels of complexity, with different combinations of traits at each level. Okay. So they're basically answering the question, how did cognition evolve? But they're also answering the question of, what is complex cognition? What does it involve, and what can we target? If we look at the tree of life, or we look at sort of take a phylogenetic view of cognition, if we consider all organisms that exhibit different types of complex behavior, things we might consider to be complex. They could be octopus, or it could be crows, or it could be social insects, or it could be humans. And we consider all of those different types of forms of cognition. What do they share in common? And then maybe what are the things that are unique, what also maybe are very similar? So what's convergent? So this is where we're getting, all of this, and this is what, why we're doing this, is to sort of figure out the sort of the breadth of cognition for all of the complexity of cognition across the tree of life. How can we best define complexity in cognition? It's one thing to look at humans and say, we'll just copy humans. That's another thing to actually think about how cognition has played out across species. When given the opportunity, can we evolve different versions of cognition? Or, are there just certain contexts where, some types of cognition are favored over others? And, so in this paper, they give some putative examples of complex cognition in three lineages. They look at vertebrates, cephalopod mollusks, and eutheropods. So vertebrates, we have two examples, New Caledonian crows and scrub jays. And of course, those are organisms, species that are very famous for being able to manipulate tools, being able to plan for food resources, having a theory of mind or being able to mentally attribute other cognitive states, and then having a good level of spatial memory or being able to build cognitive maps. Of course, they use these things for food caching, for manufacturing tools, for moving their food and recaching. So a lot of this involves, sort of strategic abilities and manipulating the environment. And so, this is there's certain there's a certain brain architecture there. There's certain things that bird cognition focuses on, and so those are, again, we could build, say, like an AI system, or we could hypothesize that cognition is all about what birds do, and we could copy birds, and we could be okay, but we also have to consider maybe some other systems and show how those things maybe are convergent or maybe they're unique. So then we turn to cephalopod mollusks. Those are octopus, cuttlefish, and squid. They also, of course, also use tools. They exhibit significant behavioral flexibility beyond like sort of reactive behaviors. They have complex visual communication, these chromatophores in their skin to signal each other and to signal predators and things like that, or signal prey. And they can do this very easily. And then they also have spatial memory and cognitive maps. And then eutheropods, which are basically social insects, honeybees and dragonflies, and they have a lot of these same features. They also have referential communication, and they have very involved, very elaborate behaviors for working together, building honeycombs, foraging behaviors, and being able to predict prey trajectories. So all of those are kind of like, taken as like a set of diverse types of intelligences. And then thinking, in Michael Levin, I know he does the diverse intelligences thing where he has this idea of competencies and you gain different competencies. In this case, what we're trying to do is find sort of a unified toolkit for all of different, all different sort of examples of cognition in nature. And so that's what they did with their analysis. They had this distribution of 35 traits into 5 categories. You have the body, sensory, brain, motor, and behavioral and cognitive. And then this is, of course, across 14 non-cognitively complex lineages, but also 3 cognitively complex lineages. So to look, of course, at things that have intelligence and things that don't, and maybe why they don't. And so this is sort of a story of parallel evolution of mind and body. So we know kind of how many different ways has this been done in evolution, and that can help us build theories of cognition. So again, this is a phylogeny here of animals. So we start with the basal metazoan, first metazoan. And of course, we have sponges that branch off early. We have eumetazoa, which are ctenophores, cnidarians, some marine invertebrates going up to chordates, and then going up to marine invertebrates. And then, we have vertebrates in chordata. And, we have all of our biodiversity in this tree, in animals. So we have bilaterians, we have different evolutionary paths to these different taxa. And so, you can imagine, like, if we were to take sort of a common ancestor view of this, we look at, say, like chordata versus echinoderms, or chordata and bryozoans, or chordata and eutheropods. we have to assume that if they share cognitive traits, they might share them at a common ancestor. So the common ancestor, for example, of chordata and Eutheropoda is bilateria. So if we think, okay, well, those two clades or groups share different cognitive traits, that they originated in the common ancestor. But that's probably not reasonable because maybe they don't, maybe they don't share, maybe that common ancestor isn't the origin for every trait. Maybe cognition is a matter of convergent or parallel evolution. In other words, those abilities evolved independently in these two different lineages, but basically got to the same place. That suggests that the environment has much more of a role to play, but also the sort of linkage has much more of a role to play. That there are different traits that are linked, and that linkage enables the evolution of intelligence. So that's the idea here, is that you have convergent evolution and common ancestry, and it's a balance between the two to explain cognitive evolution. This just shows the diversity of brains. These are bird brains on the left, and these are insect brains in the middle, and then cephalopod brains on the right. And you can see that there are these different structures or different sets of structures that are involved in these different seats of intelligence. So you have these first order sensory regions, which are visual regions, optic lobe, olfactory lobe, olfaction being scent. So we have sensory inputs. We also have low to mid-level motor regions. So we have a cerebellum, we have a medulla oblongata, and we have subeosphageal mass or ganglion. Those are things that are involved in motor control and in motor behaviors. In birds, of course, we have a very large cerebellum and a medulla oblongata. In insects, we have the SMSG, and then in cephalopods, we also have an SMSG region as well. So there are different ways in which the anatomy sort of does the same things or similar things. So they're different anatomical structures. They're specialized to different degrees, but they'll kind of do similar things. And then the mid-level visual motor regions, like the optic tectum, the lobula plate complex, and the medulla, are all kind of in different, so we have the optic tectum in birds, we have the lobula plate complex in insect brains, and then the medulla specialized in cephalopods. We also have snails down in D, so they have they're non-cognitively complex. And so they have this very different neural architecture. So this just goes to show you kind of a negative control here. And so, this just shows you how different neural architectures can yield similar behaviors, convergent behaviors. Now, that being said, you also have things that evolve kind of together. You can have cerebellum that does similar things, but maybe it has a similar kind of function, but very different kinds of behavioral outcomes in, say, birds and in mammals. So this is kind of, this balance of common ancestry and convergent evolution. Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about here. And so developing common standards is difficult for several reasons, not the least of which is that cognition in general is a very fuzzy concept, one that involves different defining characteristics in different disciplines, and one that arguably may not even be amenable to any strict categorical definition. So, and then these are the kind of their traits. So they have these, again, this is kind of like this Michael Levin gaining competencies idea, where you have foundational traits, intermediate traits, and advanced traits in these different categories. So again, we have foundational traits in a large number of lineages. We have striated muscle, neurons, and nerve tissue. Those are, across all of our lineages. We have multimodal sensing in most of them, but not all of them. Mobility, bilateral symmetry. Those, the window is starting to narrow there. image-forming eyes, polarized locomotion, central nervous system, olfactory sensation, and then limited associative learning. And those are all these foundational traits. Not every lineage has the ones that are higher up on this stack. Then we have the intermediate traits, so we have structured brains, motor hierarchies, appendular locomotion, appendicular locomotion, object manipulation, 3D mobility. Those are all intermediate, and those are shared by a smaller number of lineages. Then what's shared by a smaller number of lineages still are these advanced traits like flexible limbs, 3D motion sense, high resolution eyes, associative learning, and these are in these three up at the top, 3D motion sense, and UAL and CPF. Those are in these cognitively complex lineages only. So we get this buildup of traits that lead to this complex cognition, and the complex cognition lineages share these three traits at the top, but also share all these other things down below. So you can see that the number of advanced traits in cognitively complex lineages is higher than, say, like something like annelids, where it's not cognitively complex. And then there are other non-cognitively complex lineages that have very few, if any, of the traits on the list. All right, so then they talk about laminated centers of the brain. We have the laminated visual centers, where we see that this gives these organisms that have this sort of lamination an advantage in terms of processing. It allows you to take an image from a photoreceptor layer, go down to multiple layers of lateral inhibitory and excitatory connections. Goes down to efferent neurons tuned to different visual features. It provides centers for processing, high-level and mid-level centers. And then this is mapped to different structures in different types of brains. So eutheropods, vertebrates, and cephalopod mollusks, and they're just different, so the cerebrum in vertebrates is equivalent to the protocerebrum in eutheropods. The optic tectum in vertebrates translates to the lobula plate in eutheropods. And in cephalopods, it's the optic medulla and the supra oseopharyngeal mass in respectively. Okay, so this is kind of going through all this, and then so they propose a number of evolutionary transitions. So their first transition is from undifferentiated tissues to differentiated nerve and muscle tissues. The second is from non-bilateral to bilateral symmetry. The third is from limbless bodies to bodies with paired appendages. The fourth is emergence of flexible limbs. And then, of course, we have cognitive outliers, which are these advanced traits in non-cognitively complex lineages. So these are, they may exhibit some aspects of cognitively complex behavior, but they don't have all of these traits. So they're, of course, cognitive outliers. And so this is, a problem with all theories is that sometimes you have edge cases or things that don't quite fit the theory. But I think this is kind of an interesting theory because it does incorporate a lot of the tree of life. Okay, this is the open peer commentary. So this is getting down to where people are now responding to this target article. And this is where people will kind of write on different aspects of the target article and kind of bolster what's been written. So, this is an article challenging the central brain dogma, new experimental insights from the moon jellyfish. This is just kind of going through their experiment here, or their model system. And this is where they argue that cognitive complexity, the idea that follows a single centralized trajectory, overlooks key gaps. So basically that you haven't, we don't have enough cognitive studies on, other than in model organisms to really say anything about this. Also, thinking about alternative neural architectures, how exotic can they be and still support complex behavior? And ecological niches, sometimes niche pressures are very important in defining cognitive complexity. This is another article or response. Cognitive imbalance is chicken and egg. Motivational force evolved alongside cognition, thinking about the role of motivation. This is an article, Pain and the Evolutionary Origins of Subjective Experience, with a nice picture of a deer with a brain cutaway, describing sort of what a deer would do in the presence of a predator, and thinking about that naturalistic view of behavior and cognitive complexity. This response is beyond the C-squared brain. Cognition is inseparable from sensory motor action, so really rooting cognition and sensory motor action. So really, a lot of these responses are really kind of unpacking this article and saying, where does it work, where does it fall short, and all of that. This response is, what's complex about complex cognition, and the idea that just challenging the idea of complexity as a criterion. This one's on sleep, considering REM sleep-like stages amongst the traits defining cognitively complex lineages. So sometimes people draw from their own expertise. This is social cognition, a crucial indicator of higher order cognitive ability across the animal phyla, kind of thinking about social cognition as sort of the milestone, the key thing that defines complex cognition. This one is evolution of social cognitive cell adaptations in unicellular organisms with complex mating traits, of thinking about single cell organisms and how they fit into this framework. This is Sarah-C, a core mechanism underlying G in evolution and development, so thinking about different measures of intelligence, or human G or animal G, G being the parameter for intelligence. This is Sarah-G, which is search, align, relate, abstract, and cognize, which is a core mechanism that they propose for intelligent behavior. This is Carrie Figdor, how to build a phylogenetic bridge to charismatic cognition. Carrie Figdor does a lot of work on defining this phylogenetic approach as a philosopher. And so this is really interesting in terms of the theory development. This is complex cognition in context. This is Vincente Raja, who does a lot of ecological psychology. So they kind of bring ecological psychology into the mix. Then tracing life-mind continuity and pivotal traits, world models and isomorphism. This is interesting from some of the things we've been doing with thinking about cybernetics and thinking about regulation. They argue that the features which are critical to sophisticated human cognition and late phylogenetic development are already present in the traits highlighted in the target article as pivotal for the development of cognitive complexity. So this is, and so I'm going to leave it there. I think this is definitely something that we could dig through all day and find interesting responses to. And so, yeah, that's a great article. So, yeah, it's kind of a different take on theory building from what the large language model was doing. But, these are ways of doing this, different ways of kind of getting to the same thing.